Hello everyone, and I hope you're having a great day. Today, we're uncovering the story of a black man who was turned away from a members-only golf club, only for the manager to discover he was the club's largest sponsor. If you enjoy powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. At exactly 8:12 a.m., a black man stepped out of a black sedan in front of Crestwood Hills Golf Club, one of the most exclusive, members-only golf clubs in Westchester County, New York. The morning air was clean. The grass was cut so precisely it looked unreal. Everything about this place whispered money, power, and quiet rules that were never written down. The man's name was Daniel Brooks. He wore a simple navy polo shirt, pressed slacks, and clean leather shoes. No logos, no flash, nothing that begged for attention. He walked toward the front entrance calmly, holding his phone loosely in one hand, like someone who had nowhere else he urgently needed to be. Daniel had been invited to play golf that morning, not by a friend, not by a member, but by curiosity. He had never seen this place in person, only its name on financial reports, donation summaries, and glossy brochures mailed to foundations. As he reached the reception desk, a white man in his early 50s stepped forward, smiling professionally. "Good morning, sir," the man said. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Daniel replied evenly. "I'm here to check in." The man glanced down at the clipboard, then back up at Daniel. The smile tightened, just slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, lowering his voice. "This is a members-only club." Daniel paused. "I understand," he said. "I was told to come by this morning." The man straightened his blazer. "Unless you're accompanied by a member," he said, "I won't be able to let you in." There was no anger in his tone, no raised voice, just policy, clean, calm, and absolute. Daniel looked past him for a moment, toward the perfectly manicured fairway visible through the glass doors. Men in crisp golf attire laughed quietly inside, drinks already in hand. Then he looked back at the man. "So you're saying," Daniel asked calmly, "there's no way for me to enter?" The man shook his head. "Not without proper credentials." Daniel nodded. "All right," he said simply. He turned and walked back toward the entrance steps without argument. No confrontation, no scene, just silence. And here's what the man at the desk didn't know. The man he had just turned away, politely, professionally, confidently, had quietly donated over $12 million to this club over the past 7 years. Money that helped renovate the East Wing, money that funded junior golf programs, money that kept Crestwood Hills afloat during 2 economic downturns. Daniel Brooks wasn't just connected to this club. He was its largest private sponsor. But at that moment, none of that mattered. Because power, when it isn't visible, is often treated as if it doesn't exist. Daniel stopped at the bottom of the steps. He took one slow breath and looked back at the building one last time. Not with anger, with understanding. Because this wasn't the first door that had closed quietly in front of him. And it wouldn't be the last. But this time, the door had made a mistake. If you think this story ends here, you're wrong. Because what happens next forces an entire institution to confront a truth it tried very hard not to see. And if you've ever been judged before being known, if you've ever been dismissed without being asked a single question, you're going to want to stay until the end. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe to this channel and like this video. Stories like this don't just entertain. They reveal how power, bias, and dignity collide in the real world. And trust me, the moment this club realizes who they turned away, everything changes. 2 hours later, Daniel Brooks sat alone in the back seat of his car as it moved slowly south toward Manhattan. Outside the window, the polished gates of Crestwood Hills disappeared behind a line of old oak trees, as if the club itself was swallowing the moment and pretending it never happened. Inside the car, there was no anger, no clenched fists, no frustrated phone calls, only silence. Daniel loosened his watch and stared at the faint reflection of his face in the glass. He had learned a long time ago that reacting too quickly gave other people power they hadn't earned. Power, to Daniel, was quiet. By the time the car pulled into the underground garage of Brooks Capital Group, his phone began to buzz. 1 call from London, 2 from San Francisco. A message marked urgent from his CFO. Daniel stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 46th floor. Within minutes, he was back in his world, a world where people waited for him to speak, where decisions moved markets, where his name opened doors without question. The boardroom lights came on automatically as he entered. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city stretching endlessly below. Steel, glass, motion. "Daniel," his CFO said over video call, "we need final approval on the Chicago redevelopment." "Approved," Daniel replied calmly. "Proceed as planned." Another executive leaned forward. "The pension fund wants confirmation on the capital allocation. They'll have it within the hour." No hesitation, no doubt. This was the version of Daniel Brooks most people knew, if they knew him at all. A self-made investor, a disciplined strategist, a man whose signature could change lives without him ever meeting the people affected. And yet, just hours earlier, that same man had been stopped at a front desk and told, "You don't belong here, not because of money, not because of status, but because of perception." Daniel ended the call and walked into his private office. The door closed softly behind him. The room was immaculate, minimalist, intentional. On the wall hung framed photos of construction projects, community centers, youth programs, evidence of impact without ego. Daniel stood still for a moment, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened a single note, one he hadn't updated in years. It contained only one line: "Never confuse access with worth." He added a second line beneath it: "Today proved it still matters." Daniel hadn't tried to enter Crestwood Hills because he wanted to play golf. He didn't even like golf that much. He went because he wanted to see something for himself. For years, his foundation had supported elite institutions that claimed to promote community outreach and diversity initiatives. Crestwood Hills was one of them. They had taken his money gladly. They had cashed every check. They had praised the generosity of Brooks Capital Group at closed-door meetings, but none of them had ever asked to meet Daniel Brooks. Anonymity had been his choice, but invisibility had been theirs. Daniel poured himself a glass of water and sat at his desk, eyes drifting toward the skyline. He thought about the look on the manager's face. Not hostility, not hatred, certainty. The certainty that Daniel did not fit the picture of who belonged there. That certainty was older than any policy, older than any sign that read members only. And that was the problem. If this resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated or judged before you spoke, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and like this video. Stories like this matter because they reflect experiences many people are told to ignore. Daniel didn't call anyone from the club. He didn't send an email. He didn't correct the mistake. Instead, he did what he always did when faced with injustice. He observed. Later that afternoon, inside the walls of Crestwood Hills Golf Club, life continued uninterrupted. Members sipped drinks on the terrace. Staff moved efficiently between rooms. And Richard Whitmore, the club's general manager, sat comfortably in his office reviewing schedules. To him, the morning had been routine. Another person turned away. Another rule enforced. Richard prided himself on maintaining order. Crestwood Hills wasn't just a club. It was a brand. And brands, in his mind, required boundaries. What Richard didn't know was that somewhere in Manhattan, a man he had dismissed without a second thought was now reviewing the very systems that kept the club alive, systems Richard had never questioned. Daniel opened a secure folder on his laptop labeled Institutional Partnerships. Crestwood Hills sat near the top. He clicked. 7 years of data filled the screen. Donation amounts, capital injections, program sponsorships. The numbers weren't emotional. They were undeniable. Daniel closed the folder and leaned back. He wasn't angry at Richard Whitmore. Richard was just the face of something larger. The real issue wasn't one man. It was a system that felt comfortable judging value at the door. And systems didn't change because of arguments. They changed because of consequences. Daniel checked the time. In exactly 3 hours, the Crestwood Hills board would be holding a routine internal meeting. An agenda item labeled simply, Financial Review. Daniel allowed himself the faintest smile. Not satisfaction. Preparation. Because the next phase of this story wouldn't happen at the front desk. It would happen behind closed doors. And when the truth finally surfaced, no amount of polite apologies would be enough to put things back the way they were. If you want to see how quickly power shifts when the truth comes out, make sure you stay with us, subscribe, and share this story. What Crestwood Hills is about to discover will change everything. Inside Crestwood Hills Golf Club, the afternoon unfolded exactly as it always had. Sunlight spilled across the polished marble floors. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers, the kind of music designed to be noticed only if it stopped. Members moved through the space with the confidence of people who had never questioned whether they belonged. At the center of it all sat Richard Whitmore, general manager, gatekeeper, and self-appointed protector of standards. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, scanning the day's incident log on his tablet. Nothing unusual. A late delivery, a scheduling conflict. One non-member turned away at the front desk. He didn't even remember Daniel Brooks' face clearly. To Richard, moments like that blended together. Small interactions handled efficiently, cleanly, without drama. That was professionalism. Across the hall, Emily Carter, Director of Member Relations, stood near the reception area, pretending to organize paperwork while her mind replayed the morning. She remembered the black man. Not because he was loud, not because he caused trouble, but because he didn't. There was something about the way he'd accepted the rejection. Calm, measured, almost familiar. Emily had wanted to say something, wanted to ask Richard if maybe they should double-check, but Crestwood Hills wasn't a place that rewarded hesitation, so she stayed quiet, and that silence would haunt her. In the dining hall, Harold Kensington, the club's president, entertained 2 longtime members over lunch. Harold was legacy, old money, 3rd generation. He spoke proudly about the club's inclusive values and community engagement, gesturing toward a framed plaque listing anonymous donors. "We're very fortunate," Harold said. "Strong financial partners, very committed." He didn't know who they were. He'd never asked. At Crestwood Hills, money was welcome. People were evaluated. That afternoon, a young caddy named Luis Martinez stood near the practice green, holding a golf bag nearly half his weight. Luis had seen the man earlier. He'd seen the way security subtly shifted when Daniel approached. He'd seen how the conversation ended before it really began. Luis didn't have the language for what he witnessed, but he understood it. People like him always did. Back in his office, Richard's phone buzzed. An internal calendar alert flashed on his screen. 3:30 p.m. Board Financial Review. Conference Room B. Richard straightened his tie and stood. These meetings were usually routine. Numbers, projections, polite applause. He grabbed a folder labeled Sponsorships and Donations, the same folder he'd skimmed dozens of times before without reading too closely. Because sponsors were faceless, and faceless things didn't challenge you. As Richard walked down the corridor, he passed the reception desk again, the space where Daniel Brooks had stood that morning. Empty now, clean, neutral, just the way institutions like it. Before entering the boardroom, Richard paused briefly, glancing at the club's mission statement engraved in brass near the door. Excellence, tradition, integrity. He nodded approvingly and stepped inside. Around the long mahogany table sat the core leadership of Crestwood Hills. Men and women dressed in quiet luxury, familiar faces, comfortable hierarchy. A large screen at the end of the room displayed financial charts. The meeting began smoothly. Quarterly revenue, membership renewals, upcoming events. Then the treasurer cleared his throat. "Before we move on," he said, "we should address the sponsorship audit requested by our external consultants." Richard felt a flicker of irritation. Audits meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant inconvenience. "Is that really necessary?" Richard asked lightly. "Our donors prefer discretion." The treasurer nodded. "Of course, but given our expansion plans, we need clarity, especially on our largest contributors." The screen changed. A list of entities appeared: foundations, trusts, corporate sponsors. Richard leaned back, half listening, until a name caught his eye. Brooks Capital Group. It appeared once, then again, then again. Next to it, numbers, large numbers. Richard leaned forward. "How much is that total?" he asked. The treasurer adjusted his glasses. "Over the past 7 years?" He paused. "Just over $12 million. The room shifted. Harold Kensington frowned slightly. "Brooks Capital. I don't recognize that name." The treasurer nodded. "Neither did I at first. The donations were structured quietly, consistent, no requests, no conditions." Richard's mouth went dry. "Who's the principal?" he asked. The treasurer clicked to the next slide. A single name appeared: Daniel Brooks. The room fell silent. Richard stared at the screen. The same first name, the same last name. A coincidence, he told himself. It had to be. Then the treasurer added, "He's also listed as the primary sponsor for our junior outreach program and the East Wing renovation." Richard's pulse quickened. His mind raced backward. Hours earlier, the front desk, the polite voice, the calm exit. "No," Richard muttered under his breath. Emily Carter, seated near the end of the table, felt her stomach drop. She knew. She'd known the moment the name appeared. Harold broke the silence. "Why have we never met this man?" The treasurer shrugged. He requested anonymity. Richard swallowed. "And where is he now?" Harold asked. Richard didn't answer. Because for the first time that day, the rules he'd enforced so confidently no longer felt solid. They felt fragile. And the door he'd closed that morning, it hadn't shut out a stranger. It had shut out the foundation holding the club up. If you're still watching, this is the moment where everything begins to unravel. If you believe accountability matters, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and comment below. Because what happens next isn't an apology. It's a reckoning. The boardroom at Crestwood Hills Golf Club felt smaller than it had just minutes earlier. The same walls, the same polished table, the same people. But the air had changed. Richard Whitmore sat frozen in his chair, staring at the name still glowing on the screen. Daniel Brooks. He replayed the morning again and again in his head. The calm voice, the measured tone, the way the man had accepted rejection without resistance. Not weak, controlled. Richard had spent his career believing he could identify importance at a glance. He had been wrong. "Why wasn't this brought to our attention earlier?" Harold Kensington asked sharply, breaking the silence. The treasurer cleared his throat. Because Mr. Brooks never wanted recognition. His donations were routed through corporate structures, perfectly legal, perfectly discreet. Emily Carter shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "So, we've been funded," she said carefully, "by a man none of us would recognize if he stood in front of us." Richard felt every eye turn toward him. Earlier that day, one of them had, and he had turned the man away. "We can fix this," Richard said quickly, forcing confidence into his voice. This was clearly a misunderstanding. But even as he spoke, he knew the word misunderstanding was doing far too much work. Harold frowned. Was he treated appropriately? The room waited. Richard hesitated for half a second too long. "He was informed of our membership policy," Richard said. "Professionally." Emily looked down. She remembered the man's face, the way he had nodded and left. Professional, yes, but dignity had been optional. Harold exhaled slowly. "This is a problem. A serious one. Because Crestwood Hills did not survive on membership dues alone. It survived on perception, on donors believing they were supporting something respectable, something above reproach." The treasurer spoke again. "There's more." He clicked to another slide. Photos appeared on the screen. Youth golf clinics, scholarship events, renovation ceremonies. All of these initiatives, the treasurer said, were fully funded by Brooks Capital Group. Richard recognized the East Wing instantly. He had cut the ribbon himself. The irony landed hard. "He's been shaping this place for years," Emily said quietly, without ever stepping inside. Richard felt his throat tighten, because the truth was undeniable now. Daniel Brooks hadn't been asking for access. He had been testing it. Across the city, Daniel sat in his office as the afternoon sun dipped lower behind the skyline. He hadn't checked his phone once. He knew the timing. Boards always noticed money eventually. He had learned that lesson early in his career. When Daniel first built Brooks Capital Group, he had tried to be visible, tried to enter rooms proudly. That version of him had been questioned, challenged, delayed. So he adapted. He stopped announcing himself. He let his work speak, and it spoke loudly. Daniel stood and walked toward the window. Below him, the city moved with indifference. He thought about how many institutions relied on support from people they would never truly welcome. How often generosity was accepted, while humanity was optional. Back at Crestwood Hills, panic began to replace confusion. "We need to contact him immediately," Harold said. "Invite him back. Apologize." Richard nodded too quickly. "Of course. I'll handle it personally." But Emily spoke up before the meeting could end. "With respect," she said, choosing her words carefully, "we should ask ourselves something first." The room stilled. "Would we be apologizing," she continued, "because we're sorry, or because we're afraid of losing his money?" No one answered, because the silence told the truth. Richard's phone buzzed. An email notification flashed across his screen. Subject line, "Brooks Capital Group, Partnership Review." His heart dropped. Daniel hadn't called, he hadn't complained, he hadn't demanded. He had initiated a review, which meant one thing. Control was no longer in Crestwood Hills' hands. "If he pulls funding," Harold muttered, "this could get ugly." Emily looked up. "Or it could get honest." Richard shot her a sharp look. Honesty had never been the club's priority. Image had, but images cracked when light hit them from the wrong angle. That evening, as the club prepared for its formal dinner service, staff whispered behind closed doors. Caddies checked their phones. Managers avoided eye contact. Something was coming, and everyone felt it. At 6:47 p.m., Richard stood alone in his office and dialed a number listed under Daniel Brooks. Principal. The line rang, once, twice, then voicemail. Richard swallowed and left a message. "Mr. Brooks," he said, voice strained but polite. "This is Richard Whitmore from Crestwood Hills. I believe there's been a misunderstanding today, and I would very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you." He ended the call and sat back heavily in his chair. For the first time in years, Richard Whitmore wasn't enforcing rules. He was waiting to see if the man he had dismissed would even grant him a response. And that was the moment the power truly shifted, because when you discover the person you excluded never needed your approval, you realize the door you guarded was never yours to control. If you're still with us, this is where the story turns irreversible. Make sure you subscribe, like, and share, because what happens next won't stay behind closed doors. It's about to become public. At 7:03 p.m., the dining hall at Crestwood Hills Golf Club was nearly full. Crystal glasses reflected the warm chandelier light. Conversations hummed softly, layered with laughter and the clink of silverware. This was the hour members loved most, the moment when the club felt untouchable, sealed off from the rest of the world. Behind the scenes, panic moved quietly. Richard Whitmore stood near the service corridor, adjusting his jacket for the third time in 10 minutes. His phone remained silent. No return call, no text, no response. Daniel Brooks had not acknowledged him. "Any word?" Harold Kensington asked as he approached, keeping his voice low. Richard shook his head. "Nothing yet." Harold's jaw tightened. "We need to get ahead of this." Ahead of what? Richard wondered. The truth? Earlier that afternoon, the board's internal review had gone deeper than anyone expected. What began as a routine audit had become a map, one that showed how deeply Brooks Capital Group was woven into the club's survival. Daniel hadn't just donated once or twice. He had stepped in every time Crestwood Hills faced risk, when membership declined during the recession, when renovation costs exceeded projections, when junior programs were on the verge of being cut. Each time, funding appeared quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. Richard realized something then that unsettled him more than the numbers. Daniel Brooks had never needed Crestwood Hills. Crestwood Hills had needed him. Across the city, Daniel sat in the back seat of his car once again, this time heading north. Not to confront, not to demand, but to observe. He had received Richard's voicemail. He deleted it without listening to the end. Daniel didn't believe in private apologies for public actions. If something was done openly, it deserved to be addressed openly. His phone buzzed again, this time from Rachel Moore, an investigative business reporter he trusted. "Daniel," she said when he answered, "I'm hearing rumors about Crestwood Hills. Anything I should know?" Daniel paused. "Not yet," he replied calmly, "but keep your evening open." When the car pulled back into the club's long driveway, Daniel stepped out calmly, just as he had that morning. This time, the front desk froze. Security straightened. Staff whispered. Richard spotted him from across the hall and hurried forward. "Mr. Brooks," Richard said, forcing a smile. "Thank you so much for coming. We owe you an apology." Daniel met his eyes. "Do you?" he asked quietly. Richard gestured toward the dining hall. "May we speak privately?" Daniel glanced at the room filled with members, people who laughed and drank under chandeliers built with his money. "No," Daniel said evenly. "I think this conversation belongs here." A hush rippled outward as people noticed the tension. "What's going on?" someone whispered. Richard's smile faltered. "Of course, if that's what you prefer." Daniel stepped forward, his presence steady but unmistakable. "My name is Daniel Brooks," he said, voice carrying without effort. "This morning, I was told I didn't belong here." Murmurs spread. Richard swallowed. "I was told," Daniel continued, "that this was a members-only club, that without the proper credentials, I could not enter." He paused. "I accepted that." The room was silent now. "But what I'm curious about," Daniel said, "is how that policy applies to the people who fund this institution." Gasps. Harold stepped forward quickly. Mr. Brooks, we deeply regret. Daniel raised a hand gently. I'm not finished. He turned to the room. For 7 years, my company has supported Crestwood Hills. Over $12 million. No press releases, no plaques, no recognition. He looked directly at Richard. Because I believed this place stood for integrity. Richard felt heat rise in his face. But today, Daniel continued, I learned something. He gestured toward the entrance. I learned that access here isn't about contribution. It's about appearance. No one spoke. Even the clink of silverware had stopped. If you've ever wondered, Daniel said, why so many institutions claim inclusion but practice exclusion, this is how. Emily Carter stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. He's right, she said. We failed him. Harold looked as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Daniel turned back to the board members. I didn't come here for an apology, he said. I came for accountability. He reached into his jacket and placed a single folder on the nearest table. Effective immediately, he said calmly. Brooks Capital Group is suspending all funding to Crestwood Hills pending a full review of your membership policies and leadership practices. The room erupted. What? You can't. This is outrageous. Daniel remained still. You're right, he said. You can't imagine losing support you never questioned. Richard felt something collapse inside him. This wasn't punishment. It was exposure. And let me be clear, Daniel added. This isn't about revenge. It's about alignment. He turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing, he said. I didn't want special treatment. I wanted equal treatment. With that, Daniel Brooks walked out of the dining hall. No shouting, no security escort, just the sound of truth landing where comfort used to be. Outside, Daniel exhaled slowly. Behind him, Crestwood Hills buzzed with confusion and fear. Ahead of him, something else waited. Change. If this moment hit you, take a second to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it. Because stories like this don't end with embarrassment. They end with transformation. By 8:30 p.m., what happened inside the dining hall at Crestwood Hills Golf Club was no longer contained within its walls. Phones were out. Messages were sent. Whispers became calls. And calls became headlines. Inside a quiet Manhattan apartment, Rachel Moore stared at her laptop screen as confirmations flooded in. Multiple sources. Consistent accounts. One undeniable name. Daniel Brooks. She picked up the phone and dialed. Daniel, she said, skipping pleasantries. This is about to break. Daniel stood by his window, city lights reflecting in the glass. I know, he said calmly. Do you want to comment? Daniel paused. Just this, he said. I didn't speak up to be heard. I spoke up so things could change. Rachel typed quickly. Across town, Crestwood Hills was unraveling. Harold Kensington sat in the boardroom again, jacket off, tie loosened, staring at his phone as alerts lit up the screen. Local investor suspends funding after racial incident at elite golf club. What the hell is happening? He muttered. Richard Whitmore stood near the wall, arms crossed tightly, trying to look composed while his world collapsed in real time. The club's legal counsel joined via speakerphone. You need to issue a statement immediately, the attorney said. Silence implies guilt. But if we say too much, Harold began. You already said too little, the attorney interrupted. Emily Carter sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. For the first time, she wasn't afraid to speak. This didn't happen because of one mistake, she said. It happened because we've been comfortable for too long. Richard turned toward her sharply. Are you saying this is my fault? Emily met his gaze. I'm saying it's everyone's responsibility, she replied. including mine. The room fell quiet. Outside the club gates, a small crowd had begun to gather. Not protesters, observers, cameras. Luis Martinez watched from a distance, leaning on his golf bag as reporters set up tripods near the entrance. He had never seen attention like this focused on Crestwood Hills. For once, the rules weren't protecting anyone. Inside the club's front office, Richard's phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Richard Whitmore," he said. A calm voice responded. "This is Daniel Brooks." Richard straightened instantly. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for calling. I want to personally apologize." Daniel interrupted gently. "This isn't a private matter anymore," he said. "So a private apology won't resolve it." Richard swallowed. "What can we do?" Daniel paused. "You can listen," he said, "and you can decide whether Crestwood Hills wants to be relevant in the future or remembered as a cautionary tale." The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone in his hand. He had enforced rules his entire career. Now he was learning what it felt like to be on the other side of power. By the next morning, the story had gone national. CNN, NBC, the New York Times. Photos of Crestwood Hill's pristine entrance ran beside headlines questioning its values. Daniel Brooks' name was everywhere, but unlike so many viral stories, this one wasn't driven by outrage alone. It was driven by facts. Donation records, board minutes, witness accounts. Daniel released a single public statement. Institutions don't change because they're embarrassed. They change because they're held accountable. That was it. No interviews, no debates. At Crestwood Hills, sponsors began calling. Some expressed concern. Others withdrew quietly. Membership inquiries slowed. Reputation, once assumed permanent, proved fragile. Harold Kensington convened an emergency meeting. "This can't continue," he said. "We need reform." Richard listened, jaw tight. Reform meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant consequences. For the first time, Richard considered something he had never allowed himself to question. What if the rules he enforced weren't neutral? What if professionalism had been a shield? Emily stood near the window, watching the press outside. "We should invite him back," she said, "not to appease him, to learn." Harold nodded slowly. "Then we do it publicly," he said, "and we accept whatever comes." Across the city, Daniel watched the coverage without satisfaction. He didn't enjoy exposure, but he understood leverage. Change rarely happened in quiet rooms. It happened when light forced its way in. That afternoon, Daniel sent one final message to the Crestwood Hills board. "I'll return, but not as a guest, as a mirror. If this moment matters to you, take a second to subscribe, like, and share this video. Because accountability doesn't come from outrage alone. It comes from people refusing to look away. And the next time Daniel Brooks walks through those gates, nothing will be the same." 3 weeks after the incident, the gates of Crestwood Hills Golf Club opened again. This time, there were no cameras waiting outside, no reporters, no banners, no applause, just a black sedan pulling quietly into the driveway. Daniel Brooks stepped out slowly, dressed as he always was, simple, composed, unassuming. Inside the club, tension sat heavy in the air. This wasn't a ceremony. This was a test. In the main conference room, the full board waited. Harold Kensington stood as Daniel entered. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for coming back." Daniel nodded politely. "Let's skip the formalities." He took a seat at the long table, placing a thin folder in front of him. "I didn't come here to punish Crestwood Hills," Daniel said evenly. "And I didn't come here to be welcomed." The board exchanged uneasy glances. "I came here," Daniel continued, "to see whether this institution is capable of change." Richard Whitmore sat stiffly at the far end of the table. For the first time since he'd taken the job, he wasn't in control of the room. Daniel opened the folder. Inside were charts, proposals, timelines. "This," Daniel said, tapping the first page, "is what accountability looks like." He outlined it calmly. Mandatory bias audits conducted by an independent firm. Transparent membership criteria made public. A civilian review committee with veto power over admissions. Scholarships for underrepresented youth tied to measurable outcomes. "No symbolic gestures," Daniel said. "No closed-door promises." Harold cleared his throat. "And if we agree?" Daniel met his gaze. "Then funding resumes," he said, "with oversight." Richard shifted in his chair. "And if we don't?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Then Crestwood Hills becomes a case study," he replied. "Not a club." Silence. This wasn't negotiation. It was reality. Emily Carter spoke next. "I support this." Several board members nodded slowly. One by one, hands were raised. Richard watched as control slipped through his fingers, not because of force, but because of clarity. The vote passed. Outside those walls, Daniel didn't celebrate. He went to work. Within weeks, the Brooks Equity in Sport initiative was launched, not housed at Crestwood Hills, but independent from it. The message was clear. Change didn't belong to one institution. It belonged to everyone willing to meet the standard. Daniel didn't put his face on billboards. He funded systems. He partnered with public schools, community centers, local coaches who had never been invited onto manicured greens. At a youth center in Yonkers, a 16-year-old named Marcus Reed held a golf club for the first time. "I didn't think this was for people like me," Marcus admitted quietly. Daniel knelt beside him. "It is now," he said. News outlets followed. Not because Daniel asked them to, because the contrast was undeniable. A man excluded from privilege, building access for others. Meanwhile, inside Crestwood Hills, changes were visible. Richard Whitmore no longer managed the front desk. He had been reassigned, quietly, without press releases. Policies were posted publicly, not framed. Posted. Luis Martinez noticed it first. Rules that once felt invisible were now written plainly, and people who once assumed they belonged had to explain why. Emily Carter took on a new role, overseeing community partnerships. For the first time, she felt aligned with her title. Weeks later, Daniel returned to Crestwood Hills, not to golf. To observe. A group of teenagers stood on the practice green, laughing, awkward, excited. None of them looked like the members who had filled the dining hall weeks earlier. That was the point. Harold approached Daniel cautiously. "I won't pretend this has been easy," he said. Daniel nodded. "It wasn't supposed to be." "But it matters," Harold added. Daniel looked out at the kids. "Yes," he said. "It does." Later that evening, Daniel sat alone again, scrolling through updates. Programs funded, schools added, cities asking to replicate the model. He paused on one message. From Richard Whitmore. "I didn't see it before. I see it now." Daniel didn't reply. Understanding didn't require forgiveness. It required change. If you're still listening, this is the moment to subscribe, like, and comment. Because this story was never about humiliation. It was about what happens when power chooses to build instead of exclude. And what comes next proves that real change doesn't end with policy. It multiplies. Change rarely announces itself. It moves quietly at first, through emails, phone calls, closed meetings, and uncomfortable questions. But once it starts moving, it doesn't stop where you expect. Within 60 days of Daniel Brooks' return to Crestwood Hills, the story had evolved beyond a single club, a single manager, or a single moment at a front desk. It had become a mirror. Across the country, private institutions began receiving calls they weren't prepared for. Sponsors asked questions they had never asked before. Members requested policy documents they'd never seen. Boards scheduled emergency reviews, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The Brooks Equity in Sport initiative expanded faster than anyone predicted. Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Dallas. Each city followed the same model: independent oversight, transparent access, community-first leadership. Daniel didn't travel with press. He traveled with binders. At a public high school gym in South Chicago, a banner hung over a makeshift driving range. Access is not a privilege, it's a responsibility. 17-year-old Marcus Reed stood beside Daniel as cameras rolled quietly from a distance. "I used to think golf was for rich people," Marcus said into a microphone. "Now I know it's just a game, and games are for anyone willing to learn." Daniel placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, not as a symbol, but as confirmation. Behind the scenes, data told a story louder than headlines. Graduation rates increased among participants. College scholarships followed. Local employment pipelines formed. These weren't promises, they were outcomes. NBC Nightly News ran a segment titled, "From Exclusion to Equity: How One Investor is Reshaping Access in Elite Sports." CNN followed with a panel discussion. But the most important conversations weren't happening on television. They were happening in boardrooms. At a private club in Florida, a board member slid a printed article across the table. "If this happens here," he said, "we won't survive it." Someone else replied quietly, "Then maybe we shouldn't." That sentence echoed across industries: golf clubs, private schools, professional associations. The rules had always existed. What changed was who was willing to challenge them. At Crestwood Hills, the transformation became visible. Membership demographics shifted. Outreach programs became permanent, not performative. Front desk staff were trained, not just in policy, but in awareness. Luis Martinez no longer felt invisible. For the first time, he saw kids who looked like him walking through the gates, not as workers, but as participants. Emily Carter stood in a newly renovated community office, reviewing reports. This wasn't damage control anymore. It was progress. One afternoon, Daniel received an invitation he didn't expect. Harvard Business School. They wanted to document the Crestwood Hills case, not as a scandal, but as a turning point, a lesson in how institutions fail, and how they can choose to rebuild. Daniel declined the spotlight, but he approved the study, because systems only change when others are forced to look at them honestly. Meanwhile, something quieter was happening. Emails poured in, from parents, from teachers, from people who had been turned away, overlooked, dismissed. One message stood out. "I was told I didn't belong somewhere once. Watching this made me try again." Daniel read it twice. This had never been about golf. It was about dignity. And dignity, once restored, spreads. By the end of the year, legislation began circulating in 2 states. Proposals requiring transparency in private institutions receiving public or charitable funding. They called it the Equitable Access Act. Daniel didn't lobby for it, but his actions had made it unavoidable. One evening, Daniel stood again at the edge of Crestwood Hills practice green. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows. A group of children packed up their equipment, laughing loudly. One young boy lingered behind. He approached Daniel cautiously. "Sir?" the boy asked. "Are you the reason we're allowed here?" Daniel smiled softly. "No," he said. "You are." The boy grinned and ran back to his friends. Daniel watched them go. The ripples had moved farther than he ever intended, and they were still moving. If you're still with us, this is the moment to subscribe, like, and share. Because this story proves something powerful. One closed door can open 1,000 others, if someone is willing to stand still long enough to let the truth catch up. And in the final chapter, you'll see how it all comes full circle. 1 year later, the gates of Crestwood Hills Golf Club opened on a quiet Saturday morning. No press, no speeches, no special announcements. Just sunlight, fresh-cut grass, and the sound of young voices echoing across a place that once felt unreachable. Daniel Brooks stood near the entrance, hands in his pockets, watching a group of children walk through the same doorway where he had been stopped. This time, no one questioned them. No one asked for credentials. No one decided whether they belonged. They simply entered. Inside the club, the space felt different. Not because the walls had changed, not because the chandeliers were gone, but because the silence had. Laughter replaced tension. Curiosity replaced caution. At the front desk, a new plaque sat in plain view. Not polished, not hidden. This institution exists to serve the community it profits from. Daniel didn't put his name on it. He never needed to. Nearby, Luis Martinez helped a young girl adjust her grip on a golf club. She smiled when the ball lifted off the grass. "I did it," she shouted. Luis laughed. "You sure did." Across the room, Emily Carter watched quietly. She thought about the days she stayed silent, and how much that silence had cost. This was different. Later that morning, Daniel walked the grounds alone. He stopped at the same spot where he had been turned away. The memory no longer burned. It clarified. Because some moments aren't meant to hurt forever. They're meant to teach. A small boy stood near the gate, looking unsure. He clutched a borrowed club tightly, eyes scanning the space as if waiting to be told no. Daniel noticed him. "You okay?" Daniel asked gently. The boy hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was allowed." Daniel knelt so they were eye level. "Let me ask you something," Daniel said. "Are you here to learn?" The boy nodded. "Then you belong." The boy smiled and ran toward the group. Daniel stood slowly. That was it. No confrontation, no correction, just access. That afternoon, Daniel declined an invitation to stay for lunch. He didn't need to be comfortable here. He needed it to be fair. As he walked back toward his car, his phone buzzed. A message from Marcus Reed. Got accepted. Full scholarship. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. This was the return on investment no ledger could capture. Across the country, similar messages arrived every week. From students. From parents. From people who had once been told, quietly and politely, that the door wasn't for them. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something had shifted. Institutions were watching now, rules were being questioned, and power, real power, was learning to listen. Daniel didn't become famous for what he endured. He became remembered for what he built, because dignity doesn't demand attention, it demands consistency. As the sun dipped lower over Crestwood Hills, Daniel took one last look at the club, a place that once saw him as an outsider, now learning what inclusion actually cost, and what it was worth. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly denied access, take a moment to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because change doesn't start with anger. It starts with someone refusing to disappear. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stand at the door long enough for the truth to walk through on its own.